Well, welcome everyone. I hope everyone can hear me, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. Really happy to have the opportunity to bring this information to so many people, and welcome to Supporting Staff and Engaging Fathers, a training for supervisors. My name's Dave Lonis. I am one of the Regional Learning Development Professionals here at OACAS, and I'm going to be your moderator today. So as we're going, please feel free to type any questions you want in the chat box, and I'll kind of be keeping track of it and ask Tim and Julie to speak to it either at the end of the presentation or as we go, if it's tying into what we're currently talking about. So with that said, it's my pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce Julie Myers and Tim Kelly. Julie is a protection manager with Family and Children's Services of St. Thomas in Elgin. Julie has been employed with our agency for 14 years and in her current role since 2008. Her leadership in the agency includes anti-oppressive practice and father engagement. Julie attended Dalhousie University for her undergraduate in social work and obtained her MSW from York University. Tim Kelly is the Executive Director of Changing Ways, an agency dedicated to working with men to end violence against women and children, and is an international trainer on working with men. Tim is the co-developer of the Caring Dads, Helping Fathers Value Their Children, a group counseling program for fathers at risk of maltreating their children or exposing their children to women abuse. Tim has worked with Family and Children's Services of St. Thomas and Elgin to train supervisors and frontline staff in engaging fathers in child welfare. Tim obtained his social work degree from Lakehead University. So I just want to draw everyone's attention to, we have a few polls posted to kind of get things going, and we wanted to, I know not everybody's going to have the chance to answer those, but if you could be thinking about that, I think it's interesting just to kind of get things started. I know for Tim and Julie, it's interesting to see if there were any different community partners joining us today, and if so, what agencies those were representing. But at this point, we're probably going to take our polls down now, and I'm going to turn it formally over to Tim and Julie to start this presentation.
Thank you. For anybody who doesn't know where Family and Children's Services of St. Thomas and Elgin is, we're located just south of London, about halfway between Toronto and Windsor, and we're a mix of an urban-rural geographic area. So the work that we've been doing at our agency has been developed over about the past 6 years, and that's what we're going to focus on today. I'm in no way an expert on this. I've just been dedicating a lot of my efforts into this work because I feel that it's a huge area that's been overlooked in child welfare, and in overlooking fathers, we're just doing a disservice to women and children and families as a whole. So the goals of this webinar today are to, we're going to examine key concepts, including why we would work with fathers, how as supervisors we can lead by example, understanding change process, the importance of engagement, and addressing fear and relational power. So throughout the examination of some case examples, we'll discuss critically supportive questions to present to staff when we're engaging our fathers in service. So throughout the webinar, we're going to focus on the practice of self-reflection as a tool in supervision of frontline workers. We want to examine our own relationship to power and possible biases that we as supervisors might have that would interfere with good supervision of our staff when dealing with fathers on our caseload. We're going to provide an overview of the model of practice that Family and Children's Services have used with Changing Ways. So leadership is important to prevent staff from overlooking, ignoring, or actively preventing fathers from engaging in child welfare services. And this may result in the potential to create greater risk to children and women. It places children's safety solely on mothers when we do not engage with fathers, and it also has the potential to isolate children from their fathers. So for the past 6 years, our two agencies have been working to better engage fathers in child welfare practice, and this has been a result of the close working relationship with the Caring Dads program. So some outcomes that we are going to talk about today that we have seen at our agency has been to promote better father engagement through supportive supervision, overcoming resistance to change in practice, and we've included a couple of quotes. So these are quotes that have come directly from child protection workers over the past 5 years, and we've just taken note of them today. So we have the child in care, so why do we care about the father? Another worker, when we started this work, said, I already do all of this, I don't need to change how I work, and in doing all this it was meeting with the father. We want to see fathers in families. Often, even when there is a father present in the family, we in child protection tend to overlook them. So he's never there when I go for the home visit, so I haven't talked to him yet. The mother doesn't want him involved, are just a couple of the quotes. And then the final outcome is understanding the difference between the father on paper versus the father in person. And for me, this was really highlighted during transfers between our intake department and family service. And so we read a lot about the father, and which tends to sway us from wanting to meet him. So a quote from one protection worker was, from what I've read and everyone says about him, the children are better off without him in their lives. And another person said, we've already worked with his kids before, and he didn't want to work with us then. And that was specifically to a case where a father then moved on to another family and had a new baby. And so we took that history of what we knew about him from the previous family. So these are just some of the outcomes that we've seen at Family and Children's Services over the time that we've been developing this working relationship. So examples from our experience of some of the issues raised by staff when myself as a supervisor are trying to engage the protection workers to work with the fathers. One child protection worker said in dealing with a man named Sean, we had asked him to simply set up a meeting between himself and the Caring Dads facilitators and the man, and he said, I've already done all this before. He doesn't want to cooperate. He knows what's expected of him. He's just an awful man who's manipulating everyone. Another worker said, Chris is so hard to reach that I saw him walking in front of our agency, so I called the police so that I could serve him court papers. I've heard and read that he's so dangerous. He's involved with gangs and drugs. And then the third child protection worker, when talking about Dave, and this was a transfer from intake to ongoing, the father was described as a slick salesman, and the protection worker actually said that to the father when she met him. She said I've got your number. You're pretty slick, and he's just using the CAS to abuse his kid's mother. So when those are some of the resistance that those are some examples of the resistance that we get when we ask people to engage with fathers. So some considerations in supervision. As a supervisor, I want to understand change behavior and understand that it's a process for staff to go through a change when we're asking for a different behavior. I also want to understand authority and exercising power. I want to understand and interpret staff's non-engagement in working with fathers. And then I also, over the years, have been self-reflective in my practice and am able to use some personal disclosure around my involvement when I was a frontline worker in working with men. So we want to model and we want to lead by example. So the partnership between Changing Ways and Family and Children's Services developed over time with a commitment from both agencies to build the relationship and to better engage fathers. So what we did, Our work involved around the development of the Caring Dads program at Changing Ways. I sat on the advisory group in the development of the program in 2005 and felt that it was important and wanted to bring the program to Family and Children Services as a program to offer to fathers. We ran several Caring Dads groups jointly with Changing Ways staff. And then in 2008, I moved into managing protection at the family service level. And so for me, that really created a greater awareness for engaging fathers in child protection practice. So over several years, we, in addition to offering the Caring Dads training, we offered joint trainings to staff internally around engaging fathers, around joint meetings were held with the fathers in the group with the facilitators and the protection staff and Changing Ways staff. And then recently we have done some small clinical supervision training, which just delves a little deeper into the engagement part that we want. So next, Tim is going to talk about acknowledging the importance of engaging fathers.
Thanks. So one of the conversations that Julie and I had over the years was really trying to get at what level of involvement fathers had in child protection practice relative to the work we were doing jointly with the Caring Dads work. And so some of the work that we did related to the Caring Dads program was take a look at some of the studies that are available to look at. So one in particular we looked at was the Nicotrachmy study, the Canadian Incident Study of Reported Child Abuse and Neglect, 2005. And what's interesting to think about for this slide is when you pull out two-parent families from all families, you begin to look at who is being investigated for types of abuse. And so when we look at two-parent families in that study, the fathers were more likely to be investigated for physical abuse. However, when we look at cases of investigation for neglect, what we see is a disproportionate number of mothers being investigated over fathers. So then also when we look at all families together and you look at sexual abuse investigations or exposure to domestic violence, what you see is an overwhelming disproportionate number of fathers that are being investigated by child welfare. When we think about the level of involvement the fathers have in families that are involved with child welfare, the need to begin to look at how do we engage fathers in this system better became really much more important as Julie and I started looking further into this work. So then, if what we look at in terms of practice, sort of historical practice of removing fathers from families as the risk parent. Can I get the next slide? Yeah. What we look at is the Canadian infanticide data over a 16-year period, Daly and Wilson. And what's important for us to understand about this slide is the lethality difference between step-parent versus a genetic parent. And when we look at ages 0 to 2, step-parents are far more likely to be have a lethal consequence for the stepchildren, and as children get older, it becomes less and less. And I think what's important for us to understand about this particular slide is if what our practice currently is to disengage from fathers or find ways to remove fathers from genetic or bio families, what we know about our fathers that we work with is they readily move on to other families or create other families or become step-parents. So again, looking at the risk and who creates the risk in many of the families that we're engaged with is the father. So again, what we're trying to do with these two slides is really highlight the importance of taking the engagement of fathers much more aggressively. The other piece to that I think is important, we'll go back one slide, is if when we do the Caring Dads program, one of the exercises we do with the men in that program is what we call a genogram. And what we do is track over time the number of families that the men in the Caring Dads program are involved with. And on average, there are three to four families that each of the men we're working with have some involvement with over a period of time, some with stepchildren, some with biological children. But the reality is looking at these men as really moving through a number of families and tracking the risk that they're creating for those families. So again, to not put too fine a point on it, as if those slides didn't, what we want to also talk about is some more reasons to engage. And many of you probably have already wrestled with or come to terms with this, but we want to really kind of put it out there and think about what benefits are there for engaging with fathers. And if we engage with fathers, we end up in a better position to understand and recognize dynamic risk factors as they become apparent and then respond appropriately. So if we are more actively engaged and pull fathers into service in a much more active way, then we're in a better position to really respond to dynamic risk factors as they present themselves. We're also better able to work with fathers to set milestones and goals and then measure those goals as we move forward with working with those fathers in practice. And we also need to understand that removing fathers from families do not prevent them from going on and having other families. I'm sure that's been a fairly common experience for everyone that's out there. The other piece that I think is really important is fathers that we do engage with is many of the men that we've worked with over time have said, I've done everything that they've asked me to do and I keep jumping through hoops, and they're just they never seem to be ending. And I guess what we need to understand is that their experience of a system versus what we're asking them to do as a child protection response. However, what engagement with fathers allows for us to do is really begin to base our decisions and judgments on clear observations of their progress in relation to whatever risks that we're identifying. And again, also coming to understand that active involvement with fathers allows for clear communication with everybody and particular communication related to what we're seeing or not seeing with the fathers. So what we have here, and again, what I want you to understand about some of the slides that we're putting up here is they are gross generalizations, but some of the work that I've been involved with, particularly related to Caring Dads and some of the work across the province, the country, and internationally, is what you see in this slide is a fairly common practice related to child welfare, and in that what we do is tend to isolate, punish, and do static risk assessments on fathers and remove them from families. And then what we do is draw a almost impenetrable circle around mothers and children, and where we expect moms to protect children, create safety plannings with moms, do risk assessments, we do safety planning with kids, we monitor her contact, we may make shelter referrals, and in some cases insist on shelter accommodations, and we put in place protection orders. And I think what this tends to do is a number of things that I'm sure all of you have experienced is one, it puts mom in a fairly untenable position in that she's monitoring kids' contact with dad and or preventing that. And so from the kids' perspective, what they see is mom preventing them from seeing their father. But on the other hand, we're also, in many cases, what we know about is that the fathers are likely still going to have some sort of contact with mom. And depending on what happens with that and whether she's able to prevent that from happening, that contact may go underground, and therefore inadvertently risks start to increase. So what we've been working particularly with the Caring Dads program and some of the work we've been trying to do with Family and Children's Services in Elgin is to think about this slightly differently and to engage fathers who are at risk in an effort to hold them responsible for keeping their families safe, and engage systems like probation if they're involved, or PAR programs, which is what Changing Ways is, to be a part of the ongoing work with him, ongoing safety planning with him around how he's going to keep his family safe, and look at ways to collaborate with other systems that might be involved with him, such as court system, probation, child protection, women's advocates, addiction services, and mental health services. So the idea is bringing to bear a lot of our services around him, and as a way for him to provide us with the evidence that he's safe to be around his kids. And then the work with mom to begin looking at doing trauma work, support for her around the kids, and re-engagement with children if she's lost authority with those kids, and support housing. One of the things that we've seen over the years with the working with fathers in the Caring Dads program is once a father begins to demonstrate and behave in ways that are much more safer around the family, and become much less controlling in that family, we see some shifts within the relationship between mom and the kids, that she becomes more clear she needs some support around, and those are really important engagements to be involved with. So one of the things that we found in working with both staff and supervisors in Family and Children's Services in Elgin is really coming to terms with the importance of building and creating relationships for success. And practice shows us that there are some basic sort of pieces that need to be attended to. So as a supervisor working with your staff, and with staff then again working with fathers. And one of the pieces I know that Julie's worked hard with is helping staff understand that the engagement process with fathers, particularly fathers who may not be interested in working with you, is a perception of fairness and transparency in the decision-making process. And the only way to create that sort of perception is to actually have an engagement and a relationship. And that relationship gets defined in two ways. One, through the relationship with the worker with the father, and with the father to the worker. So there needs to be an understanding that all parties will be heard before decisions are made. And I know this can create some conflict around standards and the need to meet standards, which has been part of the dialogue between Julie and I over the years as we've been doing this, is how do we make sense of all of this. But the idea that engagement with fathers or with supervisors engaging staff is that there is a sense of fairness in the process that we're moving towards, that we're trying to create some trust through a process of decision making, and then fostering an environment where what we do is suspend our judgment prior to hearing what everyone has to say first. And I understand that's a real challenge, because if we look at one of the things that Julie identified in one of the earlier slides, where we often will jump to a conclusion based on a paper description of what the person that we're looking at has, as opposed to taking that piece of information, but also going forward and developing a relationship with him. So one of the other considerations in supervision that Julie is going to talk about is how all of this relates to anti-oppressive practice, and particularly in the context of working with fathers.
Briefly, we just wanted to identify some points in anti-oppressive practice as a consideration when we're supervising. We know as child protection workers and other workers within the agency, we hold a considerable amount of power. We have the power to take people's children. So I don't think it's unfair to say that we are an oppressive agency. But when we're working with fathers, we also want to look at factors such as gender, obviously the gender in relation to, I know my staff on my team are all female, and so there's that discrepancy. The father's sexual orientation, race, culture, language, geographic location, class. I know for our agency, class comes into play a lot when we're working with fathers. Age, ability, faith, immigration status, and then challenges for working with staff are around their own personal safety, staff's diversity, any past experiences of confrontation that the staff have had with men, personal biases, both mine as the supervisor and also the staff's when we're working together, inexperience of the staff. I'm quite fortunate on my team. I have a very experienced staff of about 5 years plus, being the average of my 6 staff. That's not always the case in frontline protection, and so we're working with people that have 0 to 2 years in a lot of cases. And so how does that play into working with fathers, and then emotional challenges that the staff might have around working with the dads? And so we often ask, and we'll talk about this a bit further, in the past 5 years, I've asked staff, do you actually like the person that you're working with, and how does that play out? And so we talk about that in supervision. And sorry, I was going to give an example of one of the around the AOP that we had that was quite telling for me. We had a mom and a dad with about 20 years age difference between them. Mom had about a 20-year history of alcoholism, and we got involved originally because of mom's drinking and then some domestic violence that had occurred. So dad had physically assaulted the mom when she was intoxicated. We apprehended their child. The mother wasn't able to get her situation in a place where she could have the child, but the dad did. The parents separated, and the dad put forth his best effort. Dad was about 62 years old, and the child was 4, and there was a lot of ageism around the fact that, does this man even want to parent his child? He's only doing this to get back at his to get his ex-wife back, and so we really had to unpack that, and this man had to jump through hoops, I think it would be fair to say, and he achieved everything we wanted to, but that ageism that a lot of our staff had, and he felt that and experienced that and shared that with us in our Caring Dads group, that he felt that his age was working against him. So in leaving that, and then we want to understand the change behavior. So what's important to know about change for your staff when you're working with them?
Okay. So many of you may be familiar with the trans-theoretical model of change, and why we put this slide up is to kind of create a framework that Julie and I were understanding in terms of promoting change in practice at a staff level towards working with fathers. And again, it's not dissimilar to if you're working with a family and you have a family who doesn't clearly understand that there's been a problem, and what you go to them is with an action plan to have them move forward. It will tend to fall apart, and what we'll see is or interpret that behavior as resistance. So what we wanted to do when we stepped back a bit in terms of looking at staff and trying to foster change within practice of child protection staff was began to really take a look at where do frontline staff sit in terms of a continuum of change, and what does that mean in terms of the relationship between supervisor and staff, and the kinds of things that perhaps need to be focused on and help to kind of move forward. So we have a couple of examples. One was a worker who, when Julie was working with him to engage the father to be a part of the plan of care, the response was, we have the child in care. The father's been somewhat absent. Why would we want to work with him? And so rather than looking at that as a dismissive sort of response to the father, what Julie was able to do is kind of sit back and really begin to tease out with the staff that really where they were stuck is in this sort of pre-contemplation stage around working with fathers. So the work began at that point with that staff around why would we engage with fathers, what are some of the things that we need to do as a process of moving forward. And then another example that we've worked with is a staff who said, I've called him and he doesn't return my calls. And what we wanted to look at that is you have a staff who at some level understands that there's a need to follow up and call fathers. But I think the sort of process of moving a staff from this is something I should do, to actually doing and having a plan to do it is a fairly consistent supervision and support from the staff. And there was one case that Julie was talking about, that the staff that wasn't going to see the father, and you asked if that would they with the mother.
Yeah. So the worker, I had asked the worker to get a hold of the father, and she said, well, I've called him a couple of times and he's not getting back to me, so what more do you want me to do? And I said, well, I want you to call him again and keep calling him. And then, the staff kind of rolled her eyes and said, what's the point? And I said, well, if this was a mom and she didn't return your calls after 2 phone calls, what would you do? And right off the bat, she could list. She said, well, I'd go to her house, I'd knock on her door, I'd show up every day, I'd go to her work, I'd go to the school when she goes to pick up the children. And she had a whole list of things that she would do with the mom. So from that point, I was able to reframe that around the dad, and we could have a dialogue around what was it about this dad that was causing her hesitation into wanting to continue to follow through. And from that, she was able to process her feelings around fear of working with this man, fear of what he was going to do if she showed up at the door, and we could move on from there. But if I had just left it at, well, I've called him a couple of times, and so I'll just case note that, I could have very easily moved on, and we could have left the dad out. But she ended up going and knocking on his door, and he was quite fine to meet with her. But it was just that fear of the unknown.
So what we did, so when we started doing this work, and as Julie indicated, it's been about 6 years now in a process. But part of the process was getting staff and getting supervisors to begin to do some self-reflection, and an exercise that we provided for the staff and supervisors at the time was really an exercise in thinking about what is change and what does it take to create change. So that two things we were looking for as an outcome for this. One was for supervisors to understand that telling a staff member to do something is quite different than supporting them in their own process of change to get to it becoming just an intrinsic part of practice. And at the same time, working with staff to help them understand that asking people to make changes in their parenting and directing them is also a change process that needs to be engaged with. So we provided this as an exercise, and we won't do this with you today. However, if you're involved with the June training, we'll probably engage in some sort of practice around this. But again, it's looking at and this, I know Julie and I've used this in a sort of training supervision with her staff, where we've asked the question, thinking about a behavior that you might consider changing, that you've got some ambivalence about changing, about achieving the desire. And again, so this is a process of some questions to ask staff as you're asking them to make some change, is how long have you considered changing? So we can ask some specific ones around, have you considered working with fathers, and what would it make, what would you need to have in place to kind of move towards working with fathers more meaningfully? And then asking staff, what's getting in your way of engaging with fathers? And what that can do is create a dialogue, at least a starting place for a dialogue over time, in which you can then support staff. I think one of the things that's really important to understand about this process and about engaging fathers is often as a form of what we'll call resistance, but I think it's more anxiety around engaging fathers. What you'll have people come forward with is their worst cases or present worst case scenarios as a reason or to justify a particular kind of practice around fathers. And I think what's really important in terms of asking for change and asking for practice change is to help staff understand that if we allow our worst case fathers or our worst case scenarios to drive all of our practice, then we're missing an opportunity to engage with fathers that might otherwise become more engaged in our system. So often when I'm hearing that from people, that they'll give me an example of the absolute worst case they've ever had on file, then the response to that, to kind of roll with that sort of resistance, is to say, well, then do what you wanted, in terms of your heavy-handed practice with that guy. However, don't let that be the practice that gets in the way of your forming relationships with other people. So I guess looking for people's responses when you're asking them to do different practices is as important as seeing what it is that they're doing, to get at where's the anxiety lie within the practice change.
And as the supervisor, creating the space for that. So at one of, Tim and I had done a 2-day training for staff at my agency, and the first day was our regular training, and then we left them with the exercise of take a father on your caseload that you haven't met yet, whether it be you haven't had the opportunity or you're fearful, and then a month later we came back and made the space for them to be able to talk about it, and gave them that permission to go see the father and come back and process about that. And staff said they found that quite helpful and supportive in doing that. So as a supervisor, that might be something that you do between one supervision to the next, and see how that works.
So we're going to move on from this section to Julie talking about understanding authority and exercising power, and supporting staff in understanding their power in relationship to engaging fathers. Because I think this has been a challenging sort of area in some of the training that we've been doing in Elgin at Elgin CAS is in understanding the difference between power and authority in those relationships between supervisors and staff, and then between staff and the fathers.
So we want to know what staff need. What do staff need to understand about power in the context of child protection? So one of the questions that I ask to my staff is who has the power in the relationship between you and the family you're working with, or the father in this context? And hopefully people will say, the child protection workers will say that they have the staff. Now, we have done this at our agency, and we've had a variety of different staff. We've had protection support, we've had protection staff, children's services, and most of the protection staff will say that they have all the power, but it's interesting to know, or to hear the support staff say that they don't feel like they have power and they're just there to help. And so we've taken time to process that because it's the supervised access workers' case notes that help inform whether a father gets a child back, or it's the protection support workers' case notes and conversations with protection staff that help carve out decisions as to whether or not people get their children back, or children are being taken, or the interventions that we take. And so helping staff understand that we all hold the power. So what does that power look like for staff as they relate to fathers, and what does fathers' power look like as the fathers relate back? So we have, a lot of examples where fathers call every day, or yell at the worker, or tell us their credentials, and so rather than becoming defensive about it, we understand it and unpack it to say that they're trying to even out their power, or are there different reasons why fathers are behaving the way they are than what is apparent, and what makes our staff feel powerless. So how might a staff with power, so we know the staff have power, yet if they're feeling powerless, how do they react from challenges from a father? So when a father is yelling at them and the staff is feeling powerless, how does that impact how they work? So as a supervisor, I work through that with my staff around deconstructing and reframing. We want to relate to transparency and fairness. As protection workers, we don't need to be heavy-handed in order to make change. We want to authentically engage with fathers, understand the differential power, and I also need to be cognizant of the power that I hold in the relationship with my staff, and then how that translates in working with fathers as well. So we want to work with staff to find ways to join with fathers. So we can ask, when we're supervising staff and they're finding it a challenge, we can ask, why are they reluctant to talk to the father? What might be some underlying causes for the behavior I'm witnessing in my staff? And what can I do to help them find something to bring to the relationship that might make things better? Can I help them understand how the father might be feeling about meeting with them, and then exploring staff's feelings? So we don't want to pathologize the staff for their feelings. I'm also cognizant and cautious about staff colluding with fathers in an attempt to engage with them. So we want to ensure that staff aren't compromising child safety in order to align with fathers, and we also want to make sure that they're not overlooking risk just in order to build a relationship with the father. In cases of domestic violence, we've had a couple where we also don't want to ignore either parent's input into the situation. So in my experience, we've had some cases where if we have domestic violence and we move dad to the outside, we don't want to often hear what he has to say if it's countering the mother's concerns, or if he has concerns about the mother. So we've had to, I know as a supervisor, I need to be really conscious of that too, ensure that I hear everybody's voice. And sometimes it's, like I said earlier, it's as simple as asking, is there anything you like about this man? We were working early on with one child protection worker, and she had nothing good to say about this man, and she said, he's just not listening, I've told him what to do, he won't. And so it was language like that, and she was posturing when she was meeting with me, and then we brought Tim in to be able to talk about this staff, or to talk about this father, and he said, is there anything you like about this person? And her response was, well, it doesn't matter whether I like him, I can work with everybody, I treat everybody the same. But then as she started to unpack it, she said, I really don't like him. And so I think that is valid as well. We're not expected to like everybody that we work with, and how do we work around that? And sometimes it's just a matter of, again, creating space for our workers to talk about in supervision.
Oh, yeah.
So next we're going to talk about understanding and interpreting staff non-engagement in working with fathers, so motivation for change in practice.
All right, so again, looking at a model that we started using in joining with Julie and the staff at CAS and Elgin, we took some lessons from motivational interviewing strategies and applied those to supporting supervision with staff around engaging fathers. And so what I want to present here are just some key skills that are important that I know that we've supported Julie and some of the other supervising staff at CAS in using. But a starting place with trying to work with staff to engage better in fathers is finding a way to join, find empathy, and good reflective listening, which is again good practice if we're engaging with clients. It's also good practice as a supervisor when engaging with your staff. So listening to what your staff have to say, why they can't engage in fathers, and reflect with your staff about their understanding of change in practice. And it's hard, and it'll probably require practice on both your parts to begin moving this forward. The other piece that I think is really difficult when you're in a high pressure environment like CASs often are is learning how to suspend judgment or jumping to conclusions before you have everything in place. So looking at staff who are resisting or challenged to engage with fathers, jumping to the conclusion about why they might be doing that, but rather spending the time and engage with them to understand what their problem is. And that really beginning to understand that your staff, where they are on a continuum of change, and how your job or part of your role as a supervisor is to help move them forward. So again, the idea of rolling with resistance is looking at what am I hearing from my staff? What kinds of statements are my staff saying that I can interpret as anxiety or reluctance to engage with fathers and helping them to understand it. So forms of resistance can look like things we've already said. The mother doesn't want me to talk to him. He's never the one I call. I already do this. Or why are you asking me to change my work? So again, understanding that our staff's reasons for not engaging with fathers really have some sound, legitimate foundation in their own experience. And in terms of engaging as a supervisor, it's really understanding what their reasons are and then providing a way to reframe that reason to help and challenge to move them forward in that process. So again, looking for discrepancies in what our staff are doing and types of approaches. And I think Julie's example where she asked her staff, what would you do if it was a mother, is a really simple way of highlighting discrepancies in practice for staff, and then asking them, can you adapt the approach that you might take with a mother, with a father? What kind of supports do you need to move that forward? Again, some questions to ask our staff around, have you ever engaged successfully with a father, and what's different about this father, and what approaches have you taken? And then looking at staff autonomy and their support. So understanding that it's your staff's process to learn to engage differently that's important. So respecting that your staff may not be ready to make the change that you're asking them to do, but your relationship to them, which is what I've witnessed with Julie and her relationship with her staff, is to continue to engage in that dialogue and continue to move and push staff forward in a variety of different ways, respecting that it's their process for change that you're trying to engage in. And then again, reinforce positive changes that you see in your staff. And resistance to change is often based in good reasons that your staff have. They may not be good enough reasons to continue to work in that way, but nonetheless, there's some legitimate reasons that your staff are dealing with. And again, looking at what I've witnessed in Julie and some of her fellow supervisors and the engagement with staff is, some of the practice has moved from, go and meet with this man, and I've gone out with Julie and the staff and met with the man, or she's brought in outside support to actually engage with the staff in that. So to provide some supports around that, I think is really important, because what we want to understand is if we're looking for a change in practice, then it's something that we need to help build in staff so they develop a real competency and confidence in moving forward with that. Any examples? So, motivating staff. And again, these are just some summaries of what I've seen and what Julie and I have talked about over the years. Is express empathy by sharing with your staff, understanding that there are challenges to working with fathers. And, there's been a number of both meetings that I know Julie has had with her staff and that I've been involved with, where we all recognize that this is a really difficult and challenging father to work with. And so understanding that there are challenges here, empathizing with, this is challenging, and what is it we can do together to move this forward, and what's going to work for the fathers. Promoting staff's appreciation of the value for change and the discrepancies, and accepting staff defensiveness and reluctance to change as natural as needed in strong leadership and support. So those are kind of the framework that we've been working with in terms of supporting change within that agency. So the next piece that we want to start talking about is around leadership through example and self-reflection. So self-reflection and personal disclosure and supervision. And Julie's going to talk a little bit about her experience.
So we want to assist staff to reflect on their own beliefs and help them understand that their truth is not necessarily the same as the father's truth. So changes in supervision practice.
Oh, slide. Sorry, my bad. There you go.
So we want to explore with staff about the assumptions that they are going into when engaging their fathers. So the truth or belief about a situation is generally subjective, and while staff can hold many facts based on the investigation of the family case, the family and specifically the father may have a different sense of the truth. The father may present a version that creates a very positive view of himself or his actions. So we want to take time to hear him out, and this may provide some insight into what's the best approach to take with him moving a case forward. And so I had one of my child protection workers working with Michael. The father, this family was transferred to us from intake, and the father was described as a monster, was how the intake worker had transferred this to us. He had assaulted his 3-year-old with a belt, and there was 4 children in the home, and he was argumentative, and he was loud, and he was obnoxious, and so it was really emotionally vamped up or ramped up when it was transferred to us. And so my protection workers and my emotions were already quite high, and we hadn't even met the family yet. So we were involved in court because at intake he had been removed from the home, and so he was trying to get back into the home. We were requesting supervised access to ensure that he doesn't assault his children again. Our supervision order said the father will not physically discipline the children, and the father will obviously work cooperatively, and there was a whole list of things that the father was going to do. So the protection worker would meet with him and tell him what he needed to do, and the father would then tell her what needed to, or what he was doing. And so we learned this afterwards, and so after many attempts unsuccessfully for the protection worker coming back to me and saying, you know, he's just, we can't move on this, and he's not workable, and we just have to move on without him, and I don't know how he's going to get back in the home, then we had suggested having a joint meeting and bringing, this is one of our first cases, and bringing Tim in and actually meeting with the father and the protection worker and myself and the father. So when we sat down with him and asked him to start talking, he started telling his story, and the protection worker kept interrupting him and telling him that that's not the way it was, that wasn't the truth, that those weren't the facts of the case and what have you. And so Tim and I observed this interaction for a few minutes, and then we stopped it and politely asked the protection worker to let the father talk. And then the father said, "This is what it's like every time we meet." And so what I was observing was that the father and the protection worker were just talking over each other, and neither one of them were hearing each other. And so when we allowed Michael to talk and had the protection worker sit silently, and then literally gave them each a turn, we were able to break down in that meeting some concrete goals that needed to be done. And from there, then I was able to do some ongoing supervision with the protection worker around her presentation with this father and what that meant, and my observations of her in her interactions with him. We were able to really clearly define what Michael needed to do to get his children back. And so rather than saying, you know, no physical discipline, because he kept saying, I don't use physical discipline, it was as simple as saying, and this does sound simple, but we said, do not hit your child with a belt. And he said, fine, I can do that. I can demonstrate that to you. And we gave him really concrete goals to work towards. And he said, come into my home every day, watch me with my children. The protection worker was able to get into the home and tried not to talk as much as she had been previously, and she learned that hearing from him and engaging in the dialogue rather than talking over him was more beneficial. We want to have observations without judgment. So talking to staff about their observations of the father while suspending judgment is really important, or jumping to the conclusions about what they're seeing or hearing. So often people, and the fathers we work with, behave in ways that are not how they might normally behave when they're not being observed. So this can go both ways. They might behave better while they're being observed, but often negatively resistant behavior can be directly linked to their sense of being judged or dismissed regarding their presentation. So we want to work with staff to be mindful that not just their professional experience, but their personal experience may get in the way of how they're viewing the father's behavior. So supervision that I've done, I'll ask leading questions to my staff to sort through some of those complexities. So why do you think the father is acting in the way you have observed, or are there any alternative explanations for what you're seeing, and doing some reframing with staff. So we want to assist staff in sorting through their own observations from those of others that have interacted with the father. So while it's extremely important to read history and to have a good understanding of the case at our level, it's family service. So the intake workers or previous history with this family that we've had, we also want to formulate our own opinions of the father we're working at, because the time we get them at family service might not be the same presentation that intake had witnessed. So help staff understand the difference between fathers in different times and the father on paper versus the father sitting in the chair across from them. So we also want to understand the change process for fathers. So we've identified earlier that change takes time. One of the most important skills in working with staff that I've found to engage fathers differently is patience and support for change. I want to assist staff when it's necessary. That change in practice will take time, and so I understand that. And I also relay that to my staff, that it's not my expectation that the first time they get it exactly the way it needs to be done. And just as important for staff to understand that any change that they identify as necessary with the fathers will take time. We find it helpful, or I found it helpful for staff to develop clear and defined goals in working towards better engagement. So time frames for reaching goals also need to be realistic and attainable. We want to remind ourselves as well that staff relapses are possible, and that staff may fall back into old habits, just as the fathers we're working with might fall back into old habits while going through the change process. The change is not a straight line process, and it requires time and support. We want to take action without always knowing the outcome ahead of time. So I know for myself in child protection, I always want to know the end result and what we're hoping to achieve. But I've learned and hope that I have passed that on to staff that I'm working with as well, to develop trust in the process of engagement. So what might look like resistance in staff might be anxiousness or fear of not getting it right, and it takes practice to develop solid engagement skills when working with fathers.
So one of the exercises, again, that we've worked on and developed with for Julie and the training that we've been doing is actually bringing forward now at this point, when we work with staff in a training session, is looking at specific case examples and drawing on those experiences and working with staff to kind of talk through some of the challenges or some of the more successful engagements they've had. So what we'll do is ask staff, and we do this. We've done this in a couple of ways, and one of the ways I think it's been really valuable is in having more than just one team meeting. So having workers from various parts of the organization coming together to talk about cases and to process cases and think about what cases can look like as they move through a system. So what we'll do is we'll describe a case, have someone come forward with a case, bring it forward. We'll ask them to describe how they've approached the men, what are some of the beliefs they had going into that, and again, what we're looking for are a variety of different kinds of examples. So one example that we've talked about are looking at men who hold fairly strong sexist beliefs about women's roles and men's roles, and that ends up playing out in the relationship between the worker and the father himself. So we'll try to process that and have the staff at this point brainstorm some of those ideas. or how can I show empathy or engage with someone who, and also hold someone, an abuser, accountable. So again, holding those two sort of spaces at the same time. So if I'm engaging somebody and they're also someone who I think is creating risk, how do I engage with abusive men who are remaining in the home, which relates to the next one, which is men who are verbally and emotionally abusive and not physically abusive? How do I continue to work with these men? How do I continue to engage with these men? And I think part of the process is looking back and connecting these questions to cases that are ongoing in your service or have been a part of your service, and connecting it to understanding dynamic risk factors. And that the cases that we presented here as described cases are cases where, being involved allows you the opportunity to see where risk begins to change and escalate or de-escalate. And without involvement with these fathers, it would be really difficult to have those understandings. So again, coming back in a safer environment where you're doing sort of case conferencing or training to begin to put those pieces out on the table to talk about them are really important.
So we just wanted to wrap up with some reflections from Elgin, and over the past, since about 2008 when we started working actively with men to today, and I'd actually pulled a couple of my staff together to see if this was true for frontline staff and that it wasn't just me making this stuff up. So what we have found around working with men is that staff are more enthusiastic about it. They actually want to work with the men, and frontline staff across the board are going to supervisors if they're struggling and asking them. A greater willingness to collaborate with fathers. There's more dialogue going on about fathers, so we're talking about them, and that's different than it was 8 years ago or so. Less emotional reaction and inflammation when cases are being transferred from intake to ongoing, and some of that was just not buying or not receiving that information. So when staff become emotional, bringing them back down to what are the facts and what's the evidence that we have before us. There's a general decline in the agency, I would say, in fear towards working with fathers. There's more of a culture towards working with fathers. Fathers are more a part of the transfers between intake and ongoing, including ongoing meetings. And so, again, back in 2008, it would be the exception to receive a case where the father was part of the transfer meetings, and now it's almost always. And more conscious of fathers in the families and moving towards clearer roles of having fathers in the families and identifying them as caregivers. So those are some of the benefits that we've found at Elgin in the work that we've done over the years.
Yeah.
So at this point, we want to definitely open it up for questions to anyone who has any. I know hopefully we'll see some come in, but I was wondering if Tim or Julie, if you could speak to maybe how this work relates to the recent inquests that have occurred.
So not having read fully, and I'm not an expert on the inquest, what I do know that was highlighted in both of those documents was really questions and direction around father engagement and the need to better fully engage fathers and understand fathers and as part of the process. And again, I think where it goes back to is understanding the potential risk that these fathers pose and being aware of the dynamic nature or the changeable nature of that risk. But I think one of the other pieces I think that's important, and Julie touched on a little bit on one of our earlier slides, is what we often do is particularly when there's domestic violence involved, where the fathers abuse the mother and expose the children to abuse of the mother, is there's an automatic tendency to really bias against anything else that he might say or information he might bring into the case, what we end up often doing is interpreting what he has to say as ongoing part of is abuse towards the mother or the children. And I think in many cases that's probably the case, and there's probably some truth to that sort of response we have. However, I think what's important is to also listen to what he has to say and tease out the pieces that are, as best we can, that we know are ongoing abuse of the mother and then legitimate concerns that he might be bringing forward, hearing those pieces out and looking at them more closely. And I think that's some of the lessons we can learn over what's happened historically with some of the cases that are there. It's not just out, and again, that's, when we talk in the slide about encouraging staff to actually hear out the father's story completely before we jump to the conclusion about what he's doing is that important piece. But if we're not engaged with him, or if he doesn't trust the process that we're engaging in him with, then we may miss really important information for the family to keep them safe.
Great. So I see there's another a question from Heather. To start her question, Heather was wondering, really, to what extent do you engage involved fathers in an investigation when allegations are against the mother and the parents are divorced with a 50-50 custody? But just to clarify that the allegations does not have to do with the father, and the father is not the referral source.
And I laughed at the clarification because in family service, I was just going to say that most of our referrals come from the father. So as the non-offending parent who has access, we in family service would still meet with the dad and talk to him, not necessarily disclosing the concerns about the mother, but as part of the ongoing investigation, interviewing the non-offending father with the children. So we would engage involved. And I know that came up earlier around, quite early on around staff resistance in cases where the mother says, I don't want the father to know what's going on because then he could come back and use that against us. And so it's not that we don't engage or involve, it would just be how we would interview the father in that. So we would still, we still at family service level have that ongoing involvement with him.
Great. So hopefully that answers your question, Heather. And again, please feel free, anyone, to type or post any questions that you have. Or if you would prefer to just ask Tim and Julie directly, you can always just push *1 on your phones, and that will unmute your line. While we're waiting for just another minute or so to hear if there are any other questions that come in, I'll take this opportunity to share with everyone that this training is really actually kind of a two-part process. Today's is the first session, which is specifically for supervisors. But on June 11th, Tim and Julie are going to be doing another training on engaging fathers, a training for frontline staff. And it's going to be really looking at assisting child protection workers, kind of in examining their own relationships to power and possible biases that interfere when dealing with the fathers. This is an event that we are going to be trying with some new technology. We are going to be hosting a live training here in Toronto and simultaneously having it at a number of different locations across the province so that people are able to get together and experience this training together and have people there to have dialogue with, to talk with, to sort through their thinking with. So again, that training is occurring on June the 11th, and there will be some flyers being sent out in the near future to bring to really highlight all of the material around that. Is there any other questions? I don't see anyone. Oh, we've got another one coming in from Aaron, so we'll just wait a second. So, and again, going back to the training on June 11th, just to clarify, so there will be, if people would like to join us in Toronto, feel free, but if not, just talk to, I guess your training designates will be letting you know where what location would be kind of closest to your agency to allow you to attend in person. So Aaron's asking another question, and is there any way that we could get a copy of the slides? And yes, the slides will be posted on the website pretty soon. So you'll be able to have a copy of that as well. This has been, you're welcome, Erin. This has been recorded, so this session is being archived. So feel free to make use of that. And if you are having any trouble finding that, please just let us know here, and we will make sure that we get the link available to you. So I see we have another question coming in from Heather. Oh, maybe not. Oh, yeah, sorry. So can you guys read that?
What tips do you have for starting this process and intake, keeping in mind that we don't have the same amount of time with each case? Well,
that's what I get from my intake colleagues all the time, is that we don't have the same amount of time to engage with them. I think it's an optimal time. I might be biting my words because I'm moving to intake in a couple of weeks as a supervisor, but when we're meeting with people for the first time in crisis, it's those first opportunities that might make a difference. And again, I'm not sure. I just know that when transfers come over, sometimes we hear the men saying, they didn't even talk to me. So I would say just even try to engage with them. That's what we started asking for at intake, is just please make a connection with the father. So
I think if what you're going for is 100% right off the start, then that's probably a really high number of completions that you're trying to go for. But I think it's about part of the work we did with Elgin CAS was just beginning to raise the consciousness of that process of if you have the opportunity, engage with the father, and here's some support around what might that look like. And I think what's happened over time is a recognition of the importance of that relationship and the attempts to do it. Now I'm not going to speak for the entire agency there, because that's not where I work. However, it is some of the conversations that we've had. So even if we start to assess increased engagement, sorry, we jumped ahead.
Did you have a baseline in order to assess increased engagement?
No, Heather had another question first.
No, just even if we start the process, that's a positive change. I would say yes. And did we have a baseline? No, we didn't have a baseline. Well,
yeah, we kind of did. There was at one point early on in the process, I asked the director of CAS in Elgin. I'd made what was seen as this outrageous comment that CASs don't engage fathers. And this was quite a long time ago, and I'll tell you, not working in that system, you can get people's back up pretty quick if you say stuff like that. But it was in a fairly collegial environment, and what the director of CAS in Elgin at the time said, well, I'm going to go back and take a look, and what he came back with was just randomly pulling some files and took a look at how many of the files actually had service orders that included fathers in it, and out of the 14 he pulled, one had a mention of a father in it, and the other ones were all focused on mom. So when he came back to that, the conversation was, so where's the system problem in terms of engaging fathers so that fathers are more meaningfully engaged in the orders? And I think that was in tandem with the work that Julie and I had already begun doing in relation to caring dads back then. So I think we did have a sense from early on that the practice wasn't being followed or engaged in, and it wasn't really until Julie kind of took that on with her own team that there was some changes began to have.
But as far as research baseline,
no, all anecdotal. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
So at this point, I don't see anyone else typing any questions. Oh, we've got one coming in.
There it is.
Ooh, okay. You're welcome.
Oh, Miss Heather. Just saying thanks.
Okay.
Okay, Heather.
All right. Well, thanks. Thank you very much for your questions today. So based on I'm not seeing any other questions coming in, I want to thank Tim and Julie for coming today and having a chance to present this information to us. And again, please go to our members website if you want to access the archived copy or a copy of the slides. And with that, that concludes our webinar today.
Thank you all for coming. Where are we going to stop?
I'm coming home, I'm coming home. Tell the world I'm coming home. Let the rain wash away all the pain of yesterday. I know my kids